the multilateralism that you've seen in the Ukraine conflict would not have been present under Donald Trump. That would have turned out very differently, and you would not have seen the U.S. in a leadership role there.
What if Bernie Sanders had won the Democratic nomination and run against Donald Trump in 2020? Joining me to discuss this is Professor Bert Johnson. He's the co-author of New American Democracy and a professor of political science at Middlebury College in Vermont. Vermont, of course, the state represented in the Senate by Bernie Sanders. And Professor Johnson joins me now. Hello, Bert.
Happy to be here. And in contrast to whoever you are asking about, Bernie Sanders has been a member of 0 political parties in the last few decades, although he, of course, caucuses with the Democrats in Congress.
Yes, people forget that. He's been an independent senator and indeed in his whole electoral career. Let's go back to 2019 and 2020, shall we, where it's difficult to forget now, or difficult to remember now, rather, or easy to forget, that Bernie Sanders, for a time, looked like he was on course for the nomination. Moderate Democrats were divided. People like Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden, who did very badly in the early primaries and caucuses, Amy Klobuchar. It was a very crowded field, and Bernie Sanders looked like he was the only Democrat who had sufficient support to get it over the line.
Yeah, he had a very passionate following, and he does have a very passionate following. And I think early in the primary campaign of 2020, you had a lot of Democrats trying to figure out who was going to be the alternative to Bernie Sanders. And of course, that eventually became Joe Biden.
And the timing was everything, wasn't it? In that they all dropped out for Joe Biden, who's did very badly in New Hampshire and Iowa, didn't he? They dropped out before Super Tuesday, which gave him sort of basically unstoppable momentum.
Correct. Biden did very well in South Carolina, and that was a signal to the rest of the candidates, evidently, that he was the Bernie alternative. So they dropped out in favor of him.
So say Bernie does win the nomination, say Bernie Sanders does win the nomination, how does the rest of the Democratic establishment react? Do those centrist Democrats get behind him, or do we see a sort of 2016 Republican-style distancing themselves from Bernie as the nominee? Can he count on the support of the Democratic establishment?
I think one of the things that Bernie would have had going for him had he been the nominee was that the Republican nominee was, of course, Donald Trump. And antipathy to Trump was and is so severe among Democrats that they would have rallied behind whoever the nominee would have been, and that would have been Bernie. Now, that's not to say he would have won the election. I think that would have been a very close call, but I think the elite of the Democratic Party would have rallied behind him.
And the one thing Trump has going for him in 2020 is there's a growing economy. And do you think Sanders' sort of redistributive leftist politics are does it make a general election for the Democrats more difficult because Trump, despite everything else, can appeal to the financial self-interests of Republican voters who otherwise might have been turned off him for, all the reasons that we saw him lose that election?
Yes, I think Trump would have had the economy on his side. And then I think particularly you saw them floating this message during the primary campaign that Bernie Sanders is a socialist. And that is a dirty word in U.S. politics, to call somebody a socialist. And it turns off a lot of moderates, particularly suburban moderates, who are the swing voters in national politics. So that I think you would have seen happen a lot, is people just saying again and again, this is a socialist, affiliating the socialists with the USSR and tarring Bernie with that moniker.
So, but can he win, do you think? Because, Biden wins because he narrowly carries Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Are those crucial swing states in the Rust Belt ones that Bernie Sanders can win? Because that was basically the core of his offer, wasn't it? That sort of it needed a radical economic program to sort of restore those places to those deindustrialized places in much the same way that we talk about the Red Wall in British politics. Do you think it's a winnable election for Bernie Sanders?
I'm not sure. I think it would be an uphill battle for Bernie Sanders, but his rhetoric mobilizing the working class and generating this passionate following by a lot of young people particularly could have upped the turnout enough that possibly, if he has a path to victory, that enthusiasm and that turnout would have been his biggest asset.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the demographics of Sanders supporters were very different between the elections. Also, another interesting question, say he does win, lots of the key questions this presidency have faced, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, withdrawal from Afghanistan, a big question that crossed his desk. But I suppose if we're sort of saying, as you and I have sort of groped towards the conclusion, that Bernie Sanders would struggle to win in 2020, that means a second term of Trump. And that means Donald Trump answers some of the questions that Joe Biden has answered in a very different way to how Donald Trump would have answered them, particularly on Ukraine.
Yeah. I think the multilateralism that you would have seen, that you've seen in the Ukraine conflict, would not have been present under Donald Trump. That would have turned out very differently, and you would not have seen the U.S. in a leadership role there.
And it's, okay, so we've sort of reached the conclusion that Bernie Sanders has a tricky time in 2020. Trump might win a second term, but despite things working out as they did in the Democratic primaries, Bernie can probably look at Joe Biden's domestic agenda and say, okay, it's not everything that I want, but my two presidential runs in 2016 and 2020 have, to some extent, shifted the centre of gravity of Democratic politics. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is, and I think those kinds of accomplishments that Biden can tout as being very proud of, like infrastructure, like environmental policy, those are some of the things that Bernie Sanders, I think, would be very happy with. Now, it's not everything Bernie wants, but he's got a history in politics of accepting the compromise, even as he sets a goal of being very ambitious. So he wants Medicare for all, which is universal health care, but he would be happy with incremental steps in that direction.
Well, Professor Bert Johnson, co-author of New American Democracy and Professor of Political Science at Middlebury College in Vermont, thanks very much for joining us for today's What If? What if Bernie Sanders had won the Democratic nomination and run against Donald Trump in 2020? Well, Professor Johnson thinks he probably doesn't win. And that has huge ramifications for global politics and the war in Ukraine, as we were discussing there. But did it matter that Bernie Sanders didn't win? Well, if you look at Joe Biden's economic agenda, perhaps not.